Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's episode features a return appearance by Representative Ro Khanna. In this conversation, we discuss the future for the Democratic Party, the implications of Donald Trump's victory over Kamala Harris last week, and of course, his longstanding focus on economic patriotism, technology, and other areas of direct relevance to his place as Silicon Valley's congressman. Hope you all enjoy the conversation, and a huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Representative Ro Khanna, welcome back to the Realignment.
Thank you. I really enjoyed my last conversation and appreciate you having me back on.
Yeah, it's great chatting with someone like you after the actual election, because instead of just predicting or kind of forecasting, we can actually respond to the actual dynamics of what actually happens. So let's just start here. I'm in a weird place because I predicted Kamala Harris was going to win. She didn't end up winning, but the realignment framework ended up still applying. So the question for you then would be, as a Democrat, thinking of a political realignment, working class voters being up for grabs, deracialization of American politics, et cetera, what's it like to live in this current moment?
I'm still hopeful. I thought Harris would win too, but let me put one thing in perspective and then what we need to do go forward. I was born in Philadelphia. I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania in the 1980s. And if you had told me in the 1980s that we would have an African-American, Indian-American woman who would become the Democratic nominee and get 48% of the vote in Pennsylvania, I would have told you you're crazy. No one would get over 30%. So we have made tremendous progress. Now, why were we not able to get over the finish line? We have to recognize that a large slice of Americans, not just working class Americans, a large slice of Americans are economically struggling because in a modern economy, they feel that the American dream has slipped away from their families and their kids. Their kids can't buy a house, can't buy a car. And we did not do enough to, one, convey that the central issue of the inequality of opportunity in this country was at stake, and that we have bold proposals for how we're going to address that. And that, to me, has to be the mission of the Democratic Party, to address the vast majority of Americans who are struggling economically.
And if we talk to actual voters, and you and I both do this, me in a podcasting sense and you as a member of Congress, if you talk to voters, the way they would articulate that economic picture is really focusing on inflation. And something I really worry about when it comes to the ambitions of both parties is that the story we're going to tell ourselves coming out of the mid-2020s is that inflation, spending, acting boldly is going to actually be something you want to avoid. Do whatever you can to maintain some general sense of normalcy and approach things from that perspective. So how do you think about the dynamics of the need to go bold, but also recognizing we're probably going to have an incredibly skeptical set of the electorate when it comes to spending or any projects like that?
It's a great point. The fact that grocery prices were up, the fact that gas prices were up, I think just exacerbated people's sense that for the last 50 years, wages have stagnated, communities have been hollowed out, economic wealth has been concentrated in districts like mine, where you have $12 trillion of market cap, while other places have not had economic growth. And that has been the story of the last 50 years, a decline of many Americans' economic condition. And once they saw that, okay, now I'm not even being able to pay the grocery bills or the rent or the utilities, it just highlighted the frustration, a broader frustration of the loss of the American dream. We have to be honest with folks that there are two things we need to do to address this. One, we have to create more good paying, high paying, good jobs across America. That is going to require federal investment to build new modern factories, to build new apprenticeship programs for those who may not have a 4-year degree, to be able to become the world's top producer again. But that is going to have a productive return. It doesn't have to be trillions of dollars to build new modern factories in small towns and places left behind, and to build new engines of opportunity for technology jobs that are going to be part of the modern economy. And two, we've got to make sure that people's fundamental costs are reduced. Childcare costs, healthcare costs, education costs, and having free public college, having childcare at $10 a day Yeah, it's going to cost money, but it's going to create a lot more relief for folks. And I think that I call it a new economic deal. I had an op-ed in the Boston Globe about it. I think that that is a vision that we can convince the American people of.
Something I'm curious about when you refer to the new economic deal, you're obviously building on the legacy of FDR's transformative presidency. And there's been a lot of culture wars moving forward discourse that's somewhat unhelpful in either direction. But I think a good way to frame this, though, and this is always the question I have for people on the left who talk about FDR's presidency. FDR's presidency obviously advances the economic side of the American story in a bunch of different ways. Social security, investments in communities, electrifying whole parts of the country like Texas, where I'm sitting right now. But at the same time, part of what FDR was able to do to make that happen is he built a massive coalition that included farmers out in the Midwest. He had the urban machine in New York, but importantly, he had Southern segregationists, because as part of the trade-off, you basically had to say, we're going to put civil rights on the back burner. Now, luckily, there's no equivalent issue where we're going to have to make that much of a moral compromise today. But I guess I would kind of ask you, if we're thinking about building a winning, sustainable coalition, where, from a culture perspective, are the Democratic Party's leaders going to have to make trade-offs, accommodations, or just surmount a position they're just going to hold to no matter what?
Well, I think a new economic deal obviously has roots in FDR, but then it takes its inspiration also from Dr. King, who called for an economic bill of rights in the late 1960s before his assassination. FDR, of course, I just met this morning with a World War II veteran, because of Veterans Day, who was interned in the Japanese camps before he served in the military. So we have to recognize that FDR's legacy, while strong on the economy, had real blind spots on issues of race. And it was Dr. King's corrective, I think, that really provides the opportunity for a economic patriotism, a new economic deal that leads to the building of a multiracial America. Now, what does that mean concretely? It means that a new economic deal can mean new industries and steel plants in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and it could also mean convening, as I did, the major tech companies and 40 historically black colleges and universities to create pathways for $100,000 jobs with a 71% placement rate in black communities. And we can do that in Latino communities with Hispanic Serving Institute. So we need a comprehensive economic vision that provides opportunities for new industry, new wealth generation, new jobs in every part of America. And that's actually something that can bring us together. What gets compromised on this? Well, I don't think, on one sense, it's about compromising as opposed to respecting a different point of view without shaming folks. And so I am a strong supporter of trans rights. I went on Megyn Kelly's podcast to discuss Vice President Harris, but she wanted to talk about trans rights for a half hour. We had a conversation. I didn't back away from my view that trans kids should have the right to make the decisions about their health care, and that we need to be inclusive when it comes to sports, especially in the school setting. But I said, look, I listened that there are also concerns about safety. There are concerns about fairness. And we had a conversation respecting each other's point of view. And I didn't want to just say, okay, you're canceled, you're shamed. We have to be able to understand that we have to respect people who may not agree with us on every issue, and make sure they're part of a coalition, even though we don't compromise our ideals. And that's, I guess, how we build a coalition central on an economic revitalization agenda, but having people who may disagree with a social issue without selling out those social issues.
I want to be exact on this because I entirely agree with the sentiment. I was looking through your tweets today to kind of pull for research, and you retweeted a focus group result where one of the attendees said that, look, like, the Republican Party is crazy, but the Democratic Party is preachy. And sorry, I'm going to choose crazy over preachy. Can you define like what preachy is? Like, what made you sort of, let's just say, want to highlight or just like retweet that kind of point and takeaway?
Let's take my position on the trans issue, because it was such a big election day issue. My position is probably 30% agree with me, 70% disagree with me. Some in my party are saying, oh, okay, just abandon it. Do what the 70% want. I don't think that's the right strategy. I think we have to stand true to our convictions, if that's what our conviction is. And I think it looks like pandering anyway if you pretend to jettison something just for political gain. But what I would say is you can still win if you have certain positions that are 30-70, as long as you're not willing to, as long as you're willing to say that someone who may disagree with you, not automatically shame them, not automatically tell them that they're morally inferior, not automatically cancel them, not automatically assume that you have the monopoly on the truth, but engage in open conversation. Understand that they're often competing values, that these decisions that are complex moral issues are ones where we have to discuss with our fellow citizens in a way of respect and in a way of building persuasion without compromising our values. And sometimes I think we come off as Democrats that if you don't agree with all of our positions, even the positions that are 30-70 in the country, that somehow you're not as morally open, as enlightened, as educated as we are. And that, I think, is what comes off as condescending. But it doesn't come off as condescending if you say, look, I understand that this is a opinion that you may not agree with. It's a minority opinion. I hope you'll agree with me on other issues.
Something I'm curious about when you are articulating your case for economic patriotism and investing in the country, the remaining Biden stands that exist, whoever or wherever they are going to probably get in a bit of a tizzy and just say that that's exactly what we tried to do. It didn't work. We tried to do Bidenomics. We talked about the IRA. We talked about the CHIPS Act. What didn't work when it came from translating the Bidenomics policy agenda to a political case? Because there was a very serious attempt to merge those two things together. What makes your articulation or your plan different than what happened in 2022?
They did very well on policy, but they needed to have much more communication about the message to get it to stick and to tell the story for Americans and to scale it in a much bigger way and to make it much more vivid with concrete details. So what I had said to the president is put up a new steel plant in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Ohio. Be the president who says, I'm bringing steel back. And I think being there, seeing new steel come to places that had been decimated would have conveyed the symbolism of the industrial policy that the president wanted. I think that a lot of the investments, though I co-wrote the Chips and Science Act, went to places like Columbus, Ohio. Great. But they didn't go to the small towns. They didn't go to the places like Galesburg, Illinois. They didn't go to Ashtabula County. It was not hitting the most deindustrialized parts of America. We should have had a special focus on some of those communities. And we should have had an all-out economic development initiative that said we're going to try to develop with the local communities everywhere as a prime focus. That is the agenda, and that could look differently in Johnstown than it looks in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and we should involve the private sector in doing that. Finally, I would have given workers not just fighting for more wages, but giving them some equity share in the profits if executives could get them. So directionally, I would say President Biden was doing a lot of the right things, but the communication matters and the scale matters.
Something I'm curious about, and this one is always tough for me to grok as a person who's not working in the policy process. If we look at the failure points of the Bidenomics agenda, it's the gap between allocating spending, articulating even just like the broad vision issue, and the actual deployment on the ground. You could find this across a bunch of different issues, everything from the fact that we haven't built out the rural broadband we were supposed to do, even though billions of dollars were allocated for this. Secretary Buttigieg had that appearance on ABC News where he was sort of confronted with the fact that we allocated billions of dollars for EV battery charging stations, but it didn't actually happen. What, from a legislative perspective, is going wrong there when we just think about the ability to actually deploy and build things in the real world?
Well, we didn't have the state capacity for economic development in this country, and the president had to start creating it himself. And we didn't have clear metrics and timelines. We needed to measure it. I think the president should have said, I want this factory built within 1 year, and figure out how do we do it and make sure that it's standing up and that we're actually hitting the metrics. And so we, as a country, just haven't done much economic development with the state as a partner. And so there were bureaucratic issues. There were issues of movement in terms of speed. There wasn't the same type of collaboration with the local government. And, contrast that to Josh Shapiro, for example, in One Small Project, where he said, we're going to get I-95 back up and running after it was hit in 6 weeks. And the whole country was cheering for that. So we could have done 15, 20 of those projects, saying with a timeline, with completion, the president even having a clock in the White House saying, we're going to do this in a year, and then addressing people. I just think there had to be more of an execution urgency.
Yeah, so you're really articulating the need for a mindset shift. So I spend a lot of time with Silicon Valley founders, and the way I kind of explain the problem in DC is that imagine you and I are starting a company. We raised $50 million for this Series A. Raising the $50 million isn't the actual accomplishment. What actually matters is, can we actually build something with that? And I think too many people in DC are focused on like the fundraise or the allocation of the spending and not focused enough on is this actually translating into the real world? So the degree to which we could focus on that, that's obviously incredibly important. Something I'm curious to hear from you around is when it comes to, once again, that Silicon Valley part. Obviously, like Elon has a almost certainly permanently broken relationship with the Democratic Party, and this whole like, let's bring in a businessman to fix everyone thing can be overdone. But that said, I definitely think there's a world where we brought new people into government who are the people who are tasked with like, okay, build a factory in a year. These are your OKRs. This is what you're trying to do. You look a little different than the way we conceptualize a federal bureaucrat. Why didn't the party do stuff like that?
They should have. I have a good relationship with Elon. I mean, it's obviously we're on different sides, and but he still sometimes occasionally tweets out that I'm a Democrat he could get behind. I think the tragedy of what will happen under Trump is kind of using his Elon's talent to hack away at government. And instead, I would want to use Elon's talent to say, here's the money that the government is investing in new industry and factories, try to help make sure that we get it done on time and in a reasonable way. I don't need you to hack away at federal agencies like the Department of Education. I need you to help us implement what a new industrialization looks like. And we should have business leaders and voices in the implementation stage. And by the way, it's not just new factories. It could be new jobs in apprenticeships that are going to require technological competency. And it could be new jobs in AI that aren't just meaning that you're going to code AI, but that you're going to use AI for starting a small business, for starting a restaurant, for doing sales and marketing. We need to uplift the amount of good paying jobs in a modern economy in every community. And those solutions will be tailored for those communities. And I would love to see some business leaders participating in the execution of that, as opposed to just having business leaders participate in the cutting of government. How about have them make a government more effective?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in the Arsenal of Democracy World War II mobilization period, and we could definitely imagine an alternative universe where someone like Elon is like $1 a year man, where he's a private sector person who comes in. It's like, hey, like we really need to build this factory. I've read Walter Isaacson's Elon biography, and it's just sort of painful to read from today's perspective. When he was building the Gigafactory in Nevada, it seemed impossible, but he kind of got it done. And I think that there's this need to take that vision to our own industrial policy.
Tell me the history on the $1 a year man. I mean, I know, of course, FDR helped support the private sector in industrializing America, but I hadn't heard about the $1 a year. Give me a little bit of background.
It's one of those, the FDR period's a fascinating one. So basically the $1 a year men were private industry leaders. So people in the auto industry, people at Sears Roebuck, who during the lead up to World War II joined the government to help with mobilization, everything from like ammunition to transforming government. And they were just paid $1 a year because these are fat cats who didn't need money.
Right.
So it was like a service thing. And I just can imagine an alternate universe where we're taking that model and we're not applying it to war. We're not applying it to munitions. We're basically saying, hey, Elon, you're running 3 companies already. You seem pretty good to go. Take on a 4th responsibility and let's actually build the battery factory. Let's actually reshore. This is like a post-COVID 2021, 2022 moment. And I think we just have to have new models for approaching government in a different direction, because I love what you said about how what's unfortunate about Elon is that like right now, Elon's going to be tasked with firing people from the Department of Education. I don't think that's going to be particularly productive. Whenever Democrats win again, those people are going to be rehired. So like, what did that even turn into? But redirecting that Silicon Valley builder energy towards someplace productive is incredibly important. So
I love that.
Yeah.
So our
Yeah. So
mission is going to be to redirect Elon in a Democratic administration towards building
well,
things.
no, it's true. And this is where the failure comes in. Like one of my, I've had Mark Andreessen on the podcast, and I think
Mark,
It's Time to Build was
yeah,
the best op-ed that came out of that early COVID period.
right.
And what's so funny is even though Mark is so right-wing now, that's a center-left essay. If you just like think about it, you just think about government has objectives. There are public sector failures. There are public goods we need to deliver. That should have been the center-left anthem. And I think for a variety of complicated coalitional reasons, the people who needed to read and channel that energy just didn't read it.
And what do you say to the Biden folks who say that's exactly what we did? We did the center-left anthem. You say they didn't involve enough of the private sector business leaders in execution, or what would be your answer to them?
Yeah, I'd say it's that at the end of the day, a lot of my friends work in offices like your office. And like, this is where I say that I spent a lot of time with the Hewlett Foundation folks, the post-neoliberalism program. And my critique of them is always they fail to take the policy areas they're focused on and just translate them through actual politics. And I think actual politics would have been Pete Buttigieg saying, hey, I'm just in government. I'm a bureaucrat. I'm going to partner with X CEO or X person with credibility in the private sector to actually deploy these funds when it comes to building the EV charging stations. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And I think those private sector people, without any corporate cronyism, because the key thing is it's very easy to, it's like, think about the 2010s, right? Like Obama made Jeffrey Immelt, the CEO of GE, like a major government official. That didn't actually help. It didn't actually help anything with the agenda. So there's a cronyist version of this, but I think there's a very effective government needs to work with the private sector in a mixed economy like ours to deploy things. And that would have been a political project in of itself. And I just think for a variety of, once again, complicated reasons, that just did not exist within the mental model of deployment. And that's why I gave the example of people in DC just sort of think their job is to allocate money and then the problem solves itself. We now know that that doesn't work. So like what we're doing now is talking about different ways of approaching it.
I think that's great. And it'd be interesting to see how FDR avoided the cronyism, although maybe there was a patriotism with the World War that avoided that.
But here's where it gets fascinating. It was a disaster. There was incredible cronyism. A lot of people got fired. Things didn't work. This is why Harry Truman became famous, because he led the committee investigating corruption in the defense industry during the lead up to and during early World War II. The Truman Committee was incredibly famous. He had big hearings. He was showing up unannounced at all the different factories and no one would know. He was just driving his car by himself. That's the kind of, once again, this is like the center left formulation, which is we know we need to do things, but we're also the people, aggressively monitoring. And if the dollar a year man screws up, he gets fired the next week. So that's the difficult part here. But we have a model for doing this before. And I want people to draw from that moving forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's brilliant. And I guess the question is, how do we say this simply? So what is the bumper sticker on we want to build new factories with government investment and business leaders involved? Because Trump is like, okay, I want 60% tariffs and I want to cut regulation and I want to cut taxes. So how do we convey this in a catchphrase in a simple way? And then the second is, how do we balance the safeguards so that yes, you're providing the funding and you're getting the private sector, but that it's not cronyism.
I mean, I already gave the tagline. It's time to build. I think the bumper sticker was Biden comes in 2021 and it's time to build. We are going to, it's build. It's simple. This is the Trump lesson. And also I'm not advocating that we, give everyone complicated World War II history lessons here. I'm kind of talking about the side of this, which is like, this is basically the speech I would give to newly selected and hired government officials in 2021. But I think the point here is it's not Bidenomics. It's going to be morning again in America like it's 1984 again. I really think it's the time to build bumper sticker, and I'll steal that from.
But I totally agree with you. And I totally agree with you that we have the better philosophy and the better way of actually doing it than Donald Trump. But he'll say, yeah, I'm for it's a time to build too. And the way I'm going to build is, here are my three concretes. I'm going to get tariffs. I'm going to get the immigrants out because they're taking American jobs. I mean, I disagree with that, obviously, but and I'm going to make sure that we give tax credits to lower corporate tax rates to everyone who's manufacturing. And you would say, no, Trump, that's wrong. I'm going to, and then what is our boom, 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 boom?
Yeah, no, and this is where there was a missed opportunity. The Biden camp came credit that well, actually compare and contrast, right? So what happened during term one? During term one, there's the disastrous Foxconn, Wisconsin factory that isn't even built. It's an unironically cronyist disaster that actually leads anywhere. So this is why it's tough to do this now that we run the experiment. But that's why I'm focusing on like the 2021 from the lesson point. You had to from the start say, hey, I've talked about this, and you definitely know this person, but I won't name them. This person worked at the NSC, and they talk about how, like, look, there are a lot of us in the Biden administration who've thought of ourselves as Trump Democrats. We are not that we're Trumpy, not that we support Trump, but we're people who saw 2016 and were like, oh, wow. This really wasn't working. Trump isn't just about Russiagate. He's not just about all of the ways that he's crass. He was responding to something. And then, therefore, in the Biden administration, we are going to actually be the people who successfully respond to everything Trump articulated. And I just don't, for whatever reason, think that mentality spread enough through the administration to be coherent into a political project here. So that's the really frustrating thing. You really should have said in 2021, Trump failed. Here's what he was right about. We're the only ones who are actually going to get this done. And this happened effectively when it came to China policy. So the Biden administration like openly said, oh yeah, like Trump was right to reset the discourse on China, but we're actually doing it. However, no one's voting on China policy issues at all. So that was never going to be the opportunity.
But going forward, because while I hope for the president's success just as an American, in areas of manufacturing, not in other areas where I disagree. My instinct is that if he's only going to do sort of rhetoric on tariffs and only going to propose corporate tax cuts, that you're not going to suddenly have new factories appear in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, or Youngstown. So looking forward for the Democratic Party, we say, okay, it's time to build. He still isn't delivering. Here's what it's going to require differently. Would that be federal financing? Would that be using business leaders to make government more effective instead of cutting government? How do we articulate this in a simple way, what the FDR model is in a more inclusive way of FDR that is going to break through with the American public?
Well, yeah, and this is why the Josh Shapiro example, and this isn't me being a Josh Shapiro stan, but I think that was just excellent. He said, here is this, a highway that crumbles due to decaying infrastructure is just the perfect metaphor for the state of the country right now. Here's this simple issue. I identified it. I set a metric and I did it. I think every single Democratic politician in their own area needs to find a way. Like, think of Marie in Southern Washington. I'm from Portland, Oregon, so this is like close to my heart. She just did a great video on Twitter where she's like, hey, like I was talking to my constituents and they told me that like caregivers at childcare facilities couldn't peel bananas. So I just like found my example of how I then talked to the federal government. We fixed the law. Now this is fixed. Like, I think you in your own example, my advice for you would just be in your own categories, take the intellectual framework we're discussing here and just have your story. And I would basically say when it's looking for 2028 candidates, like I expect everyone to have their own version of, and this is true when it comes to economic policy. Like this, broadly speaking, there just has to be a concrete thing. Trump has the wall. Trump has deportation. Trump has tariffs. These are easy. These are simple things. Democrats need to find their own examples. And I think everyone in their own way could find one that fits their niche.
Yeah, no, I think the key is to find it, because I think the policy is what I've called for, what I call economic patriotism, is exactly this model of, modernization of steel factories. Like, we can do this. We should get people in the private sector, like Cleveland Cliffs, U.S. Steel. We should get the steel unions, and we should get the federal financing and look at places that have been deindustrialized and put up modern steel plants that we can, by the way, do with AI and robotics in a way that's going to be cost competitive. 1/6 of the carbon emission is China. Okay, they're not going to have 4,000 people in those plants, and maybe have 1,000, but that 1,000 is better than zero. And we start to do this with pill manufacturing in the United States, which we've lost to China. We start to do this with aluminum. We do it with certain types of shipbuilding. And suddenly we can have both the reindustrialization of America and then also have technology hubs emerge and new technology jobs. But I think that it's about how do we convey this simply to folks and get people to realize that what Trump is good at is sort of diagnosing the problem. Okay, we want to be the world's top producer. again, but he's short on the actual solutions, which are not just new things that you or I are saying, but are basically how America industrialized from Hamilton, Lincoln, or FDR.
Yeah, and I think this is the other thing that I'm thinking about. I'm thinking back to your earlier answer around, public free college. But you've also tweeted and written about in your most recent book, like the importance of apprenticeship. So if you're thinking about your next Joe Rogan Experience episode, I'm thinking what really matters here is the storytelling. A story I'd love to hear from you is, hey, there's a diploma divide. I know that people are super skeptical of college right now. And you may hear me talking about free higher ed and just think that's like this obvious, like socialistic democratic thing. But guess what? I have a constituent who came to me and said, you know what, Representative, I actually don't want to go to college. I want to work in manufacturing. I want to, I didn't do too hot in high school, but I want an actual apprenticeship. I think just having those specific stories that run counter to the obvious. And then the key thing in the story is that you say, okay, that's great. Like you going to Cal State or you going to Berkeley is just as valid as you actually wanted to go into the apprenticeship programs. And I just think if you're thinking, because we're talking about Rogan in a second, I just think in too many areas, Democrats at a communications level don't just have straightforward and sort of like surprising versions of that basic thing. I think the whole Mike Rowe college sucks, you don't have to just go to college thing, codes is super right. But in this increasingly kind of like right-wing leaning, like alternative media space, this isn't something that Andrew Schultz has heard. I know Andrew has not heard from a Democrat articulating, I know you think that I think that college is everything, but that's actually not true at all. Look at these apprenticeship programs that have changed people's lives in X, Y, and Z ways. Those are what Democrats need to be focusing on moving forward.
I completely agree with you. I mean, now the federal government, 400 to 1 is our spending differential between higher education and apprenticeships. And I think we don't have to bash college or PhDs. The modern factories, the modern industries are going to require PhDs, but they're also going to require electricians, plumbers, machinists, and we can expand apprenticeships so that we know that it's a team. It's like saying, okay, you need running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, but right now we aren't investing in the full team. And it doesn't mean that any one of those positions is more important than the other. I think that a false populism where Democrats just say, okay, now all we need to do is focus on those who aren't going to go to college, it doesn't ring true in a modern economy. But what we need is a thoughtful populism, which is to say we need both. We need the PhDs and the machinists, and you don't have to pit one against the other.
So last few policy areas before I let you go. So I just want to kind of like go down the list here and just get your basic thoughts on these. So let's talk about the Joe Rogan thing I referenced. That discourse is talked to death. I'm not going to ask you whether you have said Kamala should have gone on Joe Rogan, but like, who cares? It's over. I don't think it would have made a difference in the end. What really matters there is the symbolism. But I saw a great tweet that I'm going to steal that kind of referenced what really matters about the podcasting space. And you've been on a lot of these podcasts. I know a lot of these podcasters via Sagar. These are institutional, counter-establishment, edgy folks who are seeing a Democratic Party that doesn't code as cool, quote unquote, anymore in the way that it really was cool in 2008, 2010, 2012, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would just be curious. So again, the better way that I put this is when you go on these podcasts, the way that one of these podcasters is going to think of you as a Democrat is you're kind of like the principal. You're kind of like the person at the front row of their class who is getting all the right test scores versus Trump's the kid in the class throwing, paper airplanes and making everyone kind of laugh. Like, I know these guys, this is literally how they're thinking about these things at an operative level. What is you don't have this problem because you just go in that space so much, but what is your advice for Democrats who are entering into a space where no one cares that they could do Call Her Daddy or they would have a good SNL hit? How do they think about alternative media?
Well, they should be themselves for a couple of reasons. First of all, I just was on Face the Nation this morning, but you only get 7 minutes, whereas in our conversation, you can't discuss FDR and where FDR went right and wrong and what lessons we can have and how do you make government more capable and have an honest conversation. Whereas a politician, I'm saying, hey, I don't have all the answers. What do you think, Marshall? And it's almost a much more real conversation than you just asking me questions and me giving you answers that could be prepared or that I've given many times before. So the main thing with podcasts is people get to know you much better. Even if you may not get 3 million people watching this, even if you get 10,000 people, I don't know, you probably get more than that listening to it, they're going to know a lot more about Ro Khanna than someone who's seen me on MSNBC 100 times because just the depth of the conversation. The second thing is, you want to go on there and try to be yourself. And some of it is about humor and some of it is people who are entertaining, and Trump is ultimately entertaining. But I don't try to compete on that metric. Look, at the end of the day, when you want a heart surgeon You don't want the guy who was the funniest person in his med school class. You want the person who was the most competent. And at some point, when people's jobs aren't coming back or their kids' lives haven't improved, the entertainment value will run dry. I don't know when that is, but they're going to say, okay, you know what? We want actual economic surgeons. We want actual people who know how to move this economy in a way that's going to help us. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being the substantive, serious people if that's the case. I mean, you can't be condescending about it. You got to be truthful about it. But you don't have to compete with Trump of being the funniest guy in the class. Compete with our strengths. And ultimately, in my view, the Democratic Party's strength is we have the substantive vision to actually reverse the decline of the middle class. And we've got to figure out how do we get the American people to trust us on that.
So last question here, and this is actually two last questions here. So number one, I take your point about growing up in the 80s in Bucks County, being shocked that Kamala could do as well as she did. Born in Texas, I'm adopted. You could tell by my last name, grew up in Oregon. So obviously like this racial dynamic of today is like very shocking to me from a 1990s perspective. But now we're in America where like a bunch of Latino men are just going to vote Republican and be very comfortable doing so. We've kind of weirdly found multiracial democracy through not quite the way that I think people in the 2000s quite wanted. But what are the implications of that for Democrats who may just have this script of, well, if more people vote and progress happens, then that just means progressives are going to win. Like that was the script in 2011. That was the Obama era script. We're in something new. How should we think about this?
Well, to be a truly multiracial democracy, at the end of the day, it would be good if both parties were multiracial, right? I mean, that would be that we made it, and then that we're arguing on our ideas. And ultimately, I think we have to argue to whether it's to black men or black women or Latino men or Latino women that we have better pathways for them to build wealth, for their kids to have jobs, for their kids to get good apprenticeships, that the opportunities in their life and their upward mobility are better with the Democratic Party. But I don't think you really want a situation in this country where the Democratic Party is the only party that's multiracial and the Republican Party is not. That's not a recipe for becoming a cohesive multiracial democracy. Now, of course, I want to win all those votes back, but you got to win those votes back by policy.
So last question. The podcast question is really a question about young men in the realignment. What does the, let's say, 2027 Democratic Party have to say to young men that clearly didn't resonate to the degree people were expecting in 2024?
We know your life is hard. We know that many of you aren't part of success in a modern economy, that it's hard to get a house, hard to get a car. Sometimes you're stuck with debt. You may not be getting the good job that you want. And we've got a vision and actual efforts to help make it more possible for you to have a high-paying job, to have higher wages, to be able to work in something you love, and to have a future. And that is what we're going to be working on. But we see you, we hear you, and we understand that you've been a victim of a modern economy that has left a lot of people out.
For sure. That is a great place to end. Representative, great having you back on the Realignment. Let's chat again soon.
Always enjoy it, Marshall. Thank you for having me.